4 years ago, My Little Pony Friendship is Magic aired on the Hub. Yeah, it's unbelievable at how far we've come. It almost feels like yesterday. Okay, I wasn't around that long, but still. Since the beginning, bronies were an underground term that eventually grew and spread throughout the web. People were actually liking a show for girls, including myself. That's something I never expected in my entire life. So, in the celebration of the show's existence, and upon its 4th year, I wanted to spend some time out of my channel and take a look at what started it all. The one that was written by the creator herself, Lauren Faust, the Friendship is Magic pilot. Not only is this the first episode of the show, but this is the absolute first episode that I've ever watched. After searching for it online, I thought about giving it a few minutes. Afterwards, I found myself finishing the second part and being amused. Ever since then, I watched later episodes chronologically and latched onto the fandom after my overwhelming temptations. And to this day, I'm still proud of that commitment. Unfortunately, it has received a bad reputation lately. Almost no one likes it, and most people prefer the Ticketmaster for most newcomers. To be completely honest, I'm one of those who still like the episode. I think it gets criticized way too much. Has it aged poorly? Yeah, there are undoubtedly a lot of flaws imaginable in the episode. But back then, the show was new. The setting was new, the narrative structure was new, and the characters were new. I personally think this episode needs to be cut some slack. Because you do know that without this episode, we wouldn't have what we have today. This episode begins with the backstory of the two sisters, Princess Celestia and Princess Luna, who control the day and night cycle. Out of Luna's jealousy of her sister, Celestia, whose power is raising the sun and overshadowing her, her bitterness turns herself into Nightmare Moon and planning to ravage Equestria and Eternal Night. Reluctantly, with the use of the elements of harmony, Nightmare was then defeated and banished to the moon. This happens before the opening, and already I'm given historical background and a very morally powerful one at that. I'll save this for later. Jumping past 1,000 years, we're introduced to Twilight Sparkle, where she estimates the potential return of Nightmare Moon. Twilight discovers she'll be returning very soon as the 1,000th year for the Summer Sun celebration, which is around the corner, a holiday in which Celestia partakes in. But after warning Celestia about the signs of her return, Twilight is replied back to make friends, so she's sent to Ponyville to socially interact. This comes to the next piece of what interested me, Twilight Sparkle. Her characterization is shown to be antisocial. This was something I was able to connect with personally, largely because I didn't make friends in real life. But putting aside the relatability, it breaks away from the stereotyping I've seen on TV ads about the franchise prior. Every living character was nice and friendly. Twilight, on the other hand, was the opposite. She focused on something preventing a potential threat. What adds more here is strong vocabulary to her dialogue. Terms like precipice, imperative, threshold, and diligence. These are terms an older child would have to learn from, and it's put to use on a show for a younger audience. This intriguingly took the story seriously instead of talking down to the viewers. Upon arriving in Ponyville, however, as Twilight's trying to figure out the preventions, she runs into the following characters we're introduced to: Applejack, Rainbow Dash, Rarity Fluttershy, and Pinkie Pie. It uses up her entire day, and it's from this point forward that Nightmare Moon returns, and Princess Celestia is nowhere to be found, which leads to the second half. One of the following complaints I can agree with is how the characters are introduced. The character interactions were distracting and hard to connect with, especially when Twilight's in a situation of trying to solve an oncoming disaster. I get that's the point and it supposedly pays off in the second half of the pilot, but in actuality, introducing characters is very delicate because these are characters that we are to connect with in the entire show. And so far, this has been a pretty difficult start. Thankfully, the Ticketmaster opened up and established their motives better, which is why I can let this slide by instead of dwelling on it. In the second half, Twilight and her newcomers must venture into the Everfree forest to retrieve the elements of harmony and defeat Nightmare Moon. Upon their travels, however, they stumble upon one obstacle after another, each of which are a challenge to their elements: honesty, kindness, laughter, generosity, and loyalty. Admittedly, a lot of these moments are questionable and problematic. The most common complaint I hear is when Applejack is telling Twilight to let go when she was hanging on the edge of a cliff, and without any clarification that both Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy were going to catch her. I get that this is supposed to be built up to the meaning behind the situation, but it can also be morally misleading as kids get the wrong impression that in the worst case scenario, they could say something blunt that could lead into panic without any proper communication. I don't mean to harp on this scenario like everybody else does, but to be honest, I can't argue against this one. Fluttershy's interactions with the Manticore is a nice cute addition from her kindness, and that's all I can say about it. Other scenarios like Pinkie's giggle at the ghosties aren't as problematic to me, but neither are they perfect. Pinkie's laughter is the subtext of thinking positive and confronting your fears, which can be both physically and mentally. Think about it for a second. When it came to the scary tree faces, your first reaction would be to freak out and run away. Almost any child would think that. But in the end, what exactly did the trees do? Nothing. It was a psychological tactic that Nightmare Moon tried using among the others to hold them back. Pinkie was willing to bring light and optimism in times of fear. It felt more fitting to the concept. Rarity's test in generosity involved helping out a serpent when his mustache was cut off, which created a rapid river that the main six couldn't cross. Rarity came to a sacrifice of her sense of beauty for someone else by cutting off her tail to fill in the sliced mustache. I found this more fitting because she's the one that relies on beauty, but to the root of it all, it was her generous spirit. Dasha's confrontation felt a little off at first because she thought she wanted to join the Wonderbolts. On the contrary, however, her large ego is what was getting the test of her loyalty, which is why I've also found it fitting. Some have complained that Dash could have carried each of the main six to the other side instead of fixing the bridge, but in all honesty, that's just spending more effort than there needs to be. What all these have is a sense of adventure out of the ordinary. When I thought about My Little Pony before watching the show, I mostly thought of tea parties and picnics with no real conflict or theming involved. This is what the pilot started with, which is why I don't have as much of an issue with it as other viewers have. Again, the show was new at the time, and the staff didn't expect such a growing audience when experimenting with the new generation. But finally, concluding the themes of the pilot and the driving motivation of the show, comes the final act. After finally reaching the elements of harmony, which were stones, Twilight tries to work with them. Unfortunately, Nightmare Moon catches up, and Twilight confronts her. She sadly fails to get the elements to work, and what's worse, Nightmare has the stones destroyed. However, with her friends caught up, this brings support to Twilight as she latches from being an antisocial to understanding the true value of friendship.
I felt it the very moment I realized how happy I was to hear you, to see you, how much I cared about you. The spark ignited inside me when I realized that you all are my friends.
With the elements revived, Nightmare Moon is defeated and is transformed back into Princess Luna. Celestia returns, implying that it was friendship that needed to be solved. This brings back what I kept from the beginning of this review, the sisters. A part of Luna's arc was that she was jealous of her sister because she wasn't given enough appreciation that Celestia has. When pondered upon, Luna didn't have much of experience of friendship until she was converted back to herself by the elements of harmony. With Celestia by her side at this point, she's offered her friendship with something Luna didn't have, and she tearfully accepts. What fascinated me here is that Luna's arc stemmed away from what could have been a typical villain. She wasn't a villain for the sake of it. She wanted friendship and appreciation, and in doing so, she took in dictatorship, which was a desperate and wrong course of action. With her being back to normal and Celestia on her side, it has shown more flaws with these two that they had to face for the past 1,000 years. This adds more dimension to them as with the main six for this series to bring. The meaning of friendship isn't typically shown like other media. It is broken down into several elements, hence the elements of harmony. As I stated before, it is a silly yet very atmospheric and lighthearted show set up for characterization, lore, and moral reasons in engaging your audience. Of course, though, the core of the show is the characters and their experience. This to me is what brings true quality of a show for a younger audience, as much as it can be shown for an older audience. This is what impressed me from the very beginning. True, I didn't know everything about this back then, but by understanding it more, it's grown on me. And it is true that the show isn't perfect, and it most certainly doesn't live up to the other titles like could have been mentioned. But even to the episode itself, it doesn't have to be. So while it is true that the pilot has many of its flaws, think about how far the show has gone and why it still remains a well-praised title. Without this episode, this show wouldn't have as much progression. Look at the many later episodes like Twilight's Kingdom, Lesson Zero, and Pinkie Pride, and you'll see what I mean. If the episode was perfect back then with very little flaws, what room would there be to progress in establishing characters' development and relationships? Think about that for a second instead of dwelling on the flaws. With that in mind, this is an episode for me to be thankful for.